In the Western world, we're used to all sorts of different divisions within Christianity. Protestants, Catholics, Baptists, Anglicans, and so on. The same is true of religion in the Middle East, where there are many different Christian churches, various branches of Judaism, and a large number of different religious sects within Islam. But there's one particular Islamic sect that we seem to hear about more than any other: the Shia Muslims. Also known as the Shi'is or the Shiites. And we usually hear about them in a context of violence, of extreme behavior of one sort or another. The Iranian Revolution itself was to a large extent a religious revolution, which called for a return to the fundamentals of Shi'ism, and its leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, has since become perhaps the most famous Shi'i of recent times. The Shia Muslims have acquired a reputation for fanaticism. Why is this? Who exactly are the Shi'is? They're one of the two main branches of Islam. The other branch is that of the Sunnis. The Sunni Shia division is similar in some ways to the Protestant Catholic schism in Western Christianity, only it's even older. It goes all the way back to an ancient quarrel that takes place in Arabia, in the city of Medina, in 632 AD, the year in which the Prophet Muhammad dies. The trouble is, Muhammad didn't make clear who should succeed him. Some people argue that it should be Muhammad's son-in-law, a man called Ali, not only because he's the Prophet's closest male relative, but also because they believe that Muhammad actually designated Ali as his successor. Most Muslims disagree, and they choose a man by the name of Abu Bakr as the successor to the Prophet, as the first caliph of the Islamic community. But the supporters of Ali continue to claim that he has the greater right to the caliphate. And finally, he does succeed in becoming the fourth caliph. Unfortunately, this leads to a great deal of strife among the various Muslim factions, and a few years later, Ali is assassinated at a place called Najaf in Iraq. From then on, the Muslims become increasingly divided over the question of whether the succession to the Prophet should be based on selection by the leaders of the community or on a combination of descent from Ali and religious designation. The minority, who argue for descent from Ali and religious designation, become known as the Party of Ali, in Arabic, Shi'at Ali, or simply the Shia. But the majority argue for the selection principle, and since they incorporate this into the Islamic tradition, known as the Sunnah, they become known as the followers of the Sunnah, or simply the Sunnis. For centuries, the majority view of the Sunnis prevails, and nearly all the caliphs will be Sunni Muslims through the various Arab empires and throughout the 500 years of Ottoman rule. So the Sunnis became the mainstream branch of Islam, and the Shi'is became the minority branch, the underdogs, the rebels, because they never gave up their claim that Ali was the only rightful successor to Muhammad, not only the political successor, but also the spiritual successor. Because as time went on, the Shi'is also claimed that the Prophet had passed on all his religious secrets to Ali, thus making him almost as divinely inspired as his father-in-law. One of the consequences of this was that the assassination of Ali began to acquire the status of a holy martyrdom. And when Ali's younger son Hussein is also killed while fighting his father's enemies at another town in Iraq called Karbala, he in turn becomes a holy martyr. Even today, over 1,300 years later, passion plays reenacting the deaths of Hussein and his family are still performed by Shia Muslims. Extraordinary demonstrations of grief by the Shias. Over time, several generations of Ali's male descendants came to be venerated by the Shi'is as semi-divine spiritual leaders, or imams. Although none of these imams ever actually succeeded in ruling over the entire Islamic community, which continued to be largely under the control of the Sunnis. The Shi'is remained a minority faith for centuries. Until a family known as the Safavids established a dynasty in Iran at the beginning of the 16th century. The Safavids made Shi'ism the state religion of Iran, mainly to set themselves apart from their chief rivals, the Ottomans, who were Sunnis. And Iran remained almost entirely Shi'i under the dynasties which followed the Safavids, the Qajars and the Pahlavis. Even the last Shah of Iran was himself a Shi'i, although many of his subjects felt that his efforts to westernize and industrialize Iran were undermining the foundations of traditional Islamic life. This was one of the things that led to the Iranian Revolution, which itself bore all the hallmarks of classical Shi'ism: rebellion against the established order, martyrdom — many of the revolutionaries were prepared to die for the cause — and deep veneration of their religious leader. Ayatollah Khomeini gave a new lease on life to Shi'ism in Iran, which has now become the focus for Shia Muslims throughout the Middle East. Apart from Iran, Shi'ism is also the religion of more than half the population of Iraq and most of the citizens of the Yemen Arab Republic. There are also important Shi'i minorities in the Persian Gulf and parts of Saudi Arabia, as well as in Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. Over the Middle East as a whole, the total Muslim population breaks down into about 30% Shia and 70% Sunni. For much of their history, the Shi'is have suffered persecution at the hands of the Sunnis. In many of the Middle Eastern countries they inhabit, they still make up the poorest and most disadvantaged segment of the population. Because of this, their religious activism is often combined with political activism. The war between Iran and Iraq, for instance, is not simply a battle over physical territory. It's also a struggle on the part of the Iraqi government, which is Sunni, to prevent the Iranian Shi'i revolution from spilling over into Iraq and igniting its large Shi'i population, which is exactly what the Iranians would like to see happen, of course. The fact that the most important sacred shrines of Shi'ism, the tombs of Ali and Hussein, at Najaf and Karbala, are both situated in modern Iraq only adds fuel to this conflict. The situation in Lebanon is also affected by the division between the Sunnis and the Shi'is. The basic problem is that most of the political power is in the hands of the Christians, in spite of the fact that they are now outnumbered by the non-Christians. Recently published figures suggest that out of a total population of 3.5 million in Lebanon, 1.5 million are Christians, 1 million are Shia Muslims, 600,000 are Sunni Muslims, and 350,000 are Druze. So the civil war that's been going on in Lebanon almost continuously since 1975 is more than simply a power struggle between Christians and Muslims. It's also, to some extent, a power struggle among the Shi'is and the Sunnis and the Druze. Who exactly are the Druze? Many of them would say that they are Muslims, and their religion certainly began as an offshoot of Shi'i Islam. Although the Muslim Caliphate was dominated by the Sunnis, a Shi'i dynasty did succeed in gaining power in Egypt and North Africa between the 10th and the 12th centuries. One of these Shi'i caliphs is called Al-Hakim, who is so much admired by some of his followers that they claim that he's not only a divinely inspired imam, but also quite literally divine, the actual incarnation of God. One of the people associated with this deification of Al-Hakim is a Persian named Darzi, who spreads the doctrine of the divinity of the caliph among the people of southern Lebanon. Those who accept Darzi's teachings become known as the followers of Darzi, or the Druze. Today there are about 500,000 Druze living in the mountains of Lebanon and in adjoining parts of Syria and Israel. In spite of their origins under a dynasty of Shi'i caliphs, it's still debatable whether the Druze should be classified as Shia Muslims or even as Muslims at all. Although it's certainly true that in recent clashes between the Christians and the Muslims in Lebanon, the Druze have usually sided with the Muslims. The Druze are extremely well organized and have a great deal of influence on the politics of the Fertile Crescent as a whole. This is especially true in Lebanon, where there's always been a fierce rivalry between the Druze and the Maronites. There's an irony in this. The Druze and the Maronites actually have a lot in common. They are both fiercely independent minority sects who had to take refuge in the mountains of Lebanon in order to escape persecution. The Druze at the hands of the Sunnis, and the Maronites at the hands of the Greek Orthodox emperors of Byzantium. It's mainly because of a long history of violent clashes between the Druze and the Maronites in Lebanon that a complicated system of religious representation was set up in 1943. Each of the main religious groups, the Sunnis, the Shi'is, the Maronites, and the Druze, was allotted a number of seats in parliament proportional to the size of their populations. The president of Lebanon was always a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of the House a Shi'i, and the defense minister a Druze. In this way, a delicate balance was established between the most important religious sects in Lebanon to try to minimize friction between them. Unfortunately, this system of proportional representation continued to be based on a census that was taken in the 1930s, when the Christians made up the majority of the population. But by the 1970s, this was no longer the case. The Muslims combined with the Druze had become the majority, and yet the number of parliamentary seats allocated to these groups remained the same. And here we have one of the main reasons for the current turmoil in Lebanon. Religious sectarianism, and Shi'ism in particular, also enter into politics in Lebanon's closest Arab neighbor, Syria, where there is another splinter group of Shi'is called the Alawis, who are similar in some ways to the Druze, in that they too have adopted the idea of incarnation. The Alawis believe that Ali was much more than the mere spiritual heir to Muhammad. They believe that Ali was God himself in human form. That's why they're called the Alawis, the followers of Ali. Unlike the Druze, the Alawis do think of themselves as Shia Muslims. Although they only make up about 12% of the population of Syria, most of the rest of whom are Sunnis, the Alawis have dominated the Syrian government for the last 20 years or so. This only serves to complicate Syria's involvement in the Lebanese civil war. But it isn't only Islam and Christianity that are split into many different divisions in the Middle East. There are also a number of different branches of Judaism. For example, there are two chief rabbis in Jerusalem, one of them representing the Sephardic Jews and the other representing the Ashkenazi Jews. We often hear these terms, Ashkenazi and Sephardic. What exactly do they mean? Ashkenaz has long been used as the Hebrew word for Germany, and it refers to the Jews who originally lived in Germany, who became known as the Ashkenazim, and who later spread to other parts of the Western world. Echoes of the German origin of the Ashkenazim can still be heard in the language which many of them speak, Yiddish, which is short for Jüdische Deutsch, or Jewish German, a mixture of German and Hebrew. As for the other term, Sephardic, this comes from Sepharad, which is the Hebrew word for Spain, and it was originally applied to the Jews who lived in Spain, who were called the Sephardim, and who then spread to other parts of Europe and North Africa. But in Israel today, the term Ashkenazim is applied to all Western Jews, and Sephardim encompasses all Jews of Middle Eastern descent. There are many differences between the religious rites of the Sephardic and Ashkenazi branches of Judaism, which reflect their origins. Here, for example, is an Ashkenazi bar mitzvah at Masada in Israel, which is performed in a typically European style. Contrast this with the Sephardic religious service in a synagogue in Jerusalem, which is much more Oriental in nature. But I don't want to leave the impression that all Jews in the Middle East, or all Muslims, or all Christians for that matter, are devoutly religious. Far from it. There are quite a number of Middle Easterners who aren't religious at all. The spectrum of different attitudes toward religion among Muslims, Christians, and Jews is very wide. Israel is perhaps the most striking example of this. Here, the religious spectrum cuts across Western and Oriental divisions. At one extreme, there are the secular Jews, who make up over half the population and who never go to synagogues and are as free-thinking as any people in the world. And at the other extreme, there are the Orthodox Jews, who insist on a strict obedience to all the traditional Jewish rules for daily life. It's one of the paradoxes of modern Israel that on the one hand, it's a state founded by socialists with only vague reference to God. And on the other hand, the army and all government offices have to keep the kosher dietary laws, and no buses or airlines are allowed to operate on Saturdays. Given the divergence of religious opinion in Israel, it's a wonder that the country manages to hold together as well as it does. In fact, Israel's right to exist at all has been brought into question by a few ultra-Orthodox Jews who claim that only the Messiah has the right to set up an earthly kingdom for the Jewish people.